How does a single golden pince-nez unlock the secrets no one else can see? Will Sherlock Holmes' brilliant deduction reveal the truth before it's too late? Welcome to Classic Storytime Hub. Tonight's tale is The Adventure of the Golden Pince-Nez by Arthur Conan Doyle, a classic tale reimagined and retold for the modern age.
As I stared at the 3 enormous volumes that chronicle our cases from 1894, I can't help but feel overwhelmed. Each page brims with mysteries, horrors, and brilliant deductions. Choosing which ones to share is no easy task. There's the grim tale of the Red Leech and the shocking death of Crosby the banker. There's the Addleton tragedy, with its eerie secrets buried in an ancient British barrow. The famous Smith-Mortimer inheritance battle and the daring pursuit of Hewitt, the notorious boulevard assassin, which even earned Holmes a personal note of thanks from the French president and the Legion of Honor, are all here. Yet of all these extraordinary events, none fascinates me more than the episode at Yoxley Old Place. It holds not just the tragic death of young Willoughby Smith, but also the strange chain of events that would illuminate the dark motives behind the crime in ways nothing else could. It was a storm-lashed night at the tail end of November. Holmes and I were huddled together in our cluttered Baker Street rooms. He peered through a powerful lens, deciphering the faint traces of a forgotten inscription on a palimpsest, while I buried myself in a fresh surgical treatise. Outside, the wind roared down the narrow streets, and rain pounded relentlessly against the windows. There's something humbling about moments like these, even deep in the heart of London. Amid the sprawling cityscape, with its 10 miles of buildings and human toil, nature's raw force reminded me of its dominion. To the elemental powers of storm and wind, the city seemed no larger than a scattering of molehills across the countryside. I moved to the window, gazing out at the deserted street. Street lamps flickered weakly over the wet pavement, and the muddy road glistened under the downpour. A lone cab splashed through the gloom, slowly making its way from Oxford Street, a solitary figure in the storm-ravaged night. "Well, Watson," said Holmes, setting aside his lens and carefully rolling up the fragile palimpsest, "it's fortunate we don't have to venture out tonight. I've done enough for one sitting. These tiny letters strain the eyes. From what I can see, it's nothing more thrilling than some abbey accounts from the 15th century. Hello! 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 What's this?" The wind's mournful howl was suddenly joined by the rhythmic pounding of hooves and the grating squeal of wheels against the curb. The cab I had glimpsed earlier had stopped right at our door. "What on earth can he want?" I muttered, watching a figure step out. "Want? He wants us. He wants us, my dear Watson. And we, my dear Watson, want overcoats, cravats, galoshes, every tool mankind has invented to battle the weather. But wait, the cab's moving off again. Hope yet remains. If he truly wished to summon us, it would have stayed. Run down, my good fellow, and open the door. Virtue must have long been asleep elsewhere tonight." The hall lamp's glow illuminated our visitor, and I recognized him instantly. Young Stanley Hopkins, an ambitious detective whose career Holmes had often guided with keen interest, stood there, soaked but determined. "Is he in?" Hopkins asked, his voice edged with urgency. "Come up, my dear sir," Holmes called from above, his tone teasing yet welcoming. "I trust you've no plans to drag us into trouble on such a night." Hopkins climbed the stairs, the light catching the sheen of his waterproof coat. I helped him out of it, while Holmes coaxed a bright flame from the logs in the grate. "Now, Hopkins, sit down and warm your toes," Holmes said, offering him a cigar. "And here, Watson has prepared a little remedy, hot water with lemon. Nothing better for a night like this. Whatever brings you out in such a gale must be important indeed." "It certainly has been, Mr. Holmes. I've been racing from one place to another all afternoon," Hopkins said, brushing rain from his coat. "Did you see anything in the papers about the Yoxley case?" Holmes smiled faintly. "The latest I've seen today was the 15th century, I'm afraid." Hopkins chuckled. "Then you haven't missed the thing. The papers only carried a short paragraph, and it was all wrong. I wasted no time. It's in Kent, 7 miles from Chatham, 3 from the railway. I was wired for 3:15, reached Yoxley Old Place by 5, conducted my investigation, caught the last train back to Charing Cross, and came straight here by cab." "So," Holmes said, arching an eyebrow, "you are still unclear about your case?" "Not at all," admitted Hopkins, sinking into a chair. "I can't make head nor tail of it. At first glance, it seemed simple, foolproof even, but now it's a tangled web. There's no motive. That's what haunts me. A man is dead, undeniably, yet I cannot see a reason why anyone would wish him harm." Holmes lit his cigar, leaning back, the smoke curling above him like a question mark. "Let's hear the story," Holmes said. "I've got the facts in order. I just need to understand what they mean. The tale, as far as I can piece it together, goes like this. A few years ago, a country house, Yoxley Old Place, was taken by an elderly man who called himself Professor Coram. He was an invalid, confined to his bed much of the time, or hobbling around with a stick, sometimes wheeled through the grounds in a bath chair by the gardener. He was well liked by the few neighbors who visited and had the reputation of a remarkably learned man. His household was small, an elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Marker, and a maid, Susan Tarleton. Both had served him faithfully since his arrival and were known to be women of impeccable character. That's all straightforward, but somehow in the shadows of this quiet estate something sinister had begun to stir. About a year ago, the professor, immersed in the writing of a scholarly tome, realized he needed a secretary. His first 2 attempts had failed, but the third, Willoughby Smith, a bright young man fresh from university, seemed exactly what was required. Smith's days were regimented, mornings spent at the professor's dictation, evenings chasing references and passages for the next day's work. By all accounts, he was impeccable. His record at Uppingham and later at Cambridge left nothing to fault. I've seen his testimonials. He was diligent, quiet, steady, a young man with no flaws to speak of. And yet this very same Willoughby Smith met a violent end this morning in the professor's own study, a death that can only be called murder. Outside, the wind screamed and battered the windows as if echoing the horror of the tale. Holmes and I drew closer to the fire while the young inspector laid out the story detail by chilling detail. If you searched all of England, you'd be hard-pressed to find a more isolated household. Weeks could pass without a soul crossing the garden gate. The professor existed only in his work. Smith knew no one beyond the estate and lived almost exactly as his employer did. The 2 women in the house, Mrs. Marker and Susan Tarleton, had nothing to pull them outside these walls. Even Mortimer, the gardener who wheeled the professor in his bath chair, lived in a small cottage at the far end of the garden. An old Crimean veteran of impeccable character, he never set foot in the house except for duty. Yet, despite all this isolation, Yoxley Old Place was not locked away. The garden gate, just 100 yards from the main London to Chatham Road, swung open with a simple latch. Anyone could walk in, and therein lies the haunting puzzle. "Now let's hear from Susan Tarleton," Hopkins continued, "the only person who can give us a first-hand account. It happened in the late morning, between 11 and 12. At the time, she was busy hanging curtains in the front upstairs bedroom. Professor Coram remained in bed. He rarely rose before midday when the weather turned foul. The housekeeper was occupied in the back of the house. Willoughby Smith had been in his bedroom, which doubled as a sitting room, but Susan heard him move swiftly along the corridor and descend to the study below. She didn't see him, yet she swore she could recognize the firm, deliberate sound of his footsteps. She didn't hear the study door close, but moments later came a scream, a raw, wild, unnatural sound that could have belonged to a man or a woman. At the exact same moment, a heavy thud shook the old house, and then silence. For a heartbeat, Susan froze, paralyzed with shock. Then, mustering her courage, she ran down the stairs. The study door was shut. She flung it open. Inside, young Willoughby Smith lay sprawled across the floor. At first, it seemed as if he were merely unconscious, but as she leaned closer, horror gripped her. Blood was pouring from a wound at the base of his neck. A small, precise incision had severed his carotid artery. The weapon lay nearby on the carpet, a small sealing wax knife, ivory-handled and stiff-bladed, the kind found on old-fashioned writing tables. It was one of the fittings from Professor Coram's own desk. At first, the maid thought young Smith was already gone, but when she poured a little water from the carafe over his forehead, his eyes fluttered open for a fleeting moment. The professor. It was she, he murmured. Words Susan is certain he spoke aloud. He struggled to say more, raising his right hand as if to point or plead, and then collapsed, lifeless. By the time the housekeeper arrived, it was too late. She missed the young man's final cryptic words. Leaving Susan by the body, she hurried to the professor's room. Coram sat up in bed, visibly shaken, having heard enough to know that something terrible had occurred. Mrs. Marker swears he was still in his nightclothes. He could not have dressed without Mortimer, who was only allowed to assist at noon. The professor claims he heard the distant cry, but nothing more. He cannot explain Smith's last words, the professor, it was she, and wonders if they were simply the delirium of his final moments. To him, Smith had no enemies. There was no conceivable reason for anyone to wish him harm. His first instinct was to send Mortimer for the local police. A little later, the chief constable summoned me. Nothing had been moved, and strict orders were given that no one was to tread the garden paths leading to the house. It was, Hopkins admitted with a gleam in his eye, the perfect opportunity to put Sherlock Holmes theories to the test. Everything was set. Nothing at all was lacking. "Except Sherlock Holmes himself," I said, a wry smile crossing my face. "Well then, what did you make of it?" "First, Mr. Holmes," Hopkins produced a rough sketch, "take a look at this plan. It shows the layout of the professor's study and the key points of the case. It will make it easier to follow the steps of my investigation." Hopkins unfolded the rough sketch and laid it across Holmes' knee. I stood behind him, peering over his shoulder, taking in the lines and points he had marked. "It's a crude map," he admitted, "but it shows the essential details as I see them. Everything else you'll understand as we go. First question. Assuming the assassin actually entered the house, how did they get in? The only practical route was by the garden path and through the back door, which leads straight to the study. Any other approach would have been far too complicated. And the escape? It must have followed the same line. Of the two other exits from the study, one was blocked by Susan as she ran downstairs, and the other leads directly to the professor's bedroom." He paused, eyes narrowing. I immediately focused on the garden path. It had been soaked by overnight rain, which should have revealed any footprints. My investigation showed that I was dealing with a cautious, skilled hand, Hopkins continued. No clear footprints could be found along the path, yet the grass bordering it had been pressed down, showing that someone had deliberately avoided leaving tracks. There were no distinct impressions, but it was undeniable. Someone had passed that way. No one else had been there that morning, and the rain had only started overnight. That meant one thing. The murderer had walked along the border to stay hidden. Holmes raised a finger. "One moment. Where does this path lead?" "To the road," Hopkins replied. "How long is it?" "About 100 yards, he said. Holmes's eyes glinted with interest. At the gate, could you not pick up the tracks? Unfortunately, the path is tiled at that point. And on the road itself? Hopkins shook his head. No chance, it's churned into mud. Tut-tut! So these marks on the grass, Holmes interjected, were they coming or going? Hopkins shook his head. Impossible to tell. No clear outline, nothing definitive. A large foot or a small? You couldn't distinguish. Holmes let out a short, impatient sigh. It has been raining and storming like a hurricane ever since. Reading those tracks will be harder than deciphering that palimpsest. Well, it can't be helped. What did you do next, Hopkins, after being certain that you had made certain of nothing? I believe I did manage to be certain of quite a lot, Mr. Holmes. Hopkins leaned forward. First, I confirmed that someone had entered the house with great caution. Next, I examined the corridor. It's lined with coconut matting, but it bore no impressions whatsoever. From there, I moved into the study itself. The room is sparsely furnished, he continued. Its centerpiece is a large writing table with a fixed bureau. The bureau has a double column of drawers and a small cupboard in the middle. The drawers were open, as usual, and contained nothing of value. Some important papers were in the cupboard, but it was locked and untouched. The professor assures me nothing was missing. It's clear no robbery took place. And the body? Holmes prompted. The young man was found near the bureau, just to the left, as marked on the chart. The stab wound was on the right side of his neck, delivered from behind forward. It's almost impossible for this to be self-inflicted. Unless he fell on the knife, Holmes suggested. Exactly. I considered that, but the knife was found several feet away from the body, making that scenario unlikely. Then, of course, there were his dying words, and perhaps the most important piece of evidence, something clutched tightly in his right hand. From his pocket, Stanley Hopkins carefully drew a small paper packet. He unfolded it, revealing a golden pince-nez, the black silk cords at its ends snapped and dangling. Willoughby Smith had excellent vision, Hopkins remarked. There's no doubt this was snatched from the face or the person of the assassin. Holmes took the glasses in his hand, studying them with intense focus. He balanced them on his nose, squinted through the lenses, moved to the window to survey the street, and examined them under the bright lamp. Finally, with a quiet chuckle, he sat at the table and scribbled a few lines on a sheet of paper, which he tossed across to Hopkins. "That's the best I can do for you," he said, his eyes gleaming. "It may prove useful."
Hopkins read the note aloud, his voice tinged with awe. Wanted, a woman of refined appearance, dressed like a lady. She has a notably thick nose, eyes set close to either side, a puckered forehead, and a curious peering expression. Her shoulders are probably rounded. She appears to have consulted an optician at least twice in recent months. Given the remarkable strength of her glasses and the relative scarcity of opticians, tracing her should not be difficult. Holmes smiled at the look of astonishment on Hopkins' face, and I suspect my own reflection mirrored it. "Surely my deductions are simplicity itself," Holmes said lightly. "Few items offer a finer field for inference than a pair of glasses, especially a pair as remarkable as these. That they belong to a woman is clear from their delicate design, and, of course, from the last words of the dying man." Holmes held the golden pince-nez delicately between his fingers, turning them this way and that. "As to her refinement and elegant dress," he explained, "these glasses are solid gold, impossible for anyone slovenly or careless in appearance to wear. Notice, Watson, that the clips are unusually wide. This tells us that the lady's nose is broad at the base. Normally, a nose of this type is short and coarse, though exceptions exist, so I will not be dogmatic.
My own face is narrow, yet I cannot align my eyes with the center of these lenses. That means her eyes sit close to the sides of her nose. The glasses themselves are concave, of remarkable strength. A woman whose vision has been so severely restricted will naturally show it in her physical features, her forehead, her eyelids, even the posture of her shoulders. I nodded. I follow your reasoning, Holmes. I confess, though, that I cannot see how you conclude that she has visited an optician twice. Holmes held the glasses closer. Observe the small cork linings on the clips, designed to ease pressure on the nose. One is worn and slightly discolored, while the other is fresh. Clearly, one fell off and was replaced. Judging by the wear, the older clip has been in use only a few months. They match perfectly, which tells me the lady returned to the same optician for a second fitting. Hopkins let out an astonished whistle. By George, it's incredible! All this evidence in my hand, and I never noticed. I had even planned to visit every optician in London myself. Holmes allowed a faint smile. Of course you would. Now, Hopkins, have you anything more to tell us about the case? Nothing further, Mr. Holmes, said Hopkins. I think you now know as much as I do, probably more. We've made inquiries about strangers on the country roads or at the railway station, and nothing has come up. What confounds me most is the complete lack of motive. Not a shadow of a reason for this crime can anyone suggest. Ah, Holmes murmured, that is one question I cannot answer. But I suppose you want us to visit Yoxley Old Place tomorrow. If it is not too much trouble, Mr. Holmes, replied Hopkins, there's a train from Charing Cross to Chatham at 6 in the morning. We would reach Yoxley between 8 and 9. Then we shall take it. Your case has several features of great interest. I shall be delighted to investigate. Well, it's nearly 1 o'clock now. We'd best get a few hours of rest. You can take the sofa by the fire. I'll light the spirit lamp and prepare a cup of coffee before we depart. The gale had died down by morning, but the air was bitter and cold as we began our journey. The winter sun rose over the bleak marshes of the Thames and the long gray stretches of the river, landscapes that brought back memories of our pursuit of the Andaman Islander in earlier days. After a long and tiring journey, we arrived at a small station several miles from Chatham. While a horse was being hitched to a trap at the local inn, we grabbed a quick breakfast, preparing ourselves for the day ahead. By the time we reached Yoxley Old Place, everything was in readiness.
A constable awaited us at the garden gate. "Well, Wilson, any news?" "No, sir, nothing." "No reports of strangers?" "No, sir. At the station they are certain no unknown person arrived or departed yesterday." "And inquiries at inns and lodgings?" "Yes, sir. Everyone is accounted for. There's no one untraced." "Well, it's only a short walk to Chatham," Hopkins said, gesturing toward the distant road. "Anyone could stay there or catch a train without being noticed. This is the garden path I mentioned, Mr. Holmes. I swear there wasn't a mark on it yesterday." "On which side were the marks on the grass?" Holmes asked. "This side," Hopkins replied, pointing to the narrow strip between the path and the flower bed. "I can't see them now, but at the time they were unmistakable." Holmes bent low, examining the grass. "Yes, someone has walked here. Our lady must have been careful with her steps. One side, and she leaves a mark on the path. The other, and she risks leaving an even clearer one on the soft flower bed." "She must have been steady and deliberate," Hopkins agreed. An intense look crossed Holmes's face. "You say she returned this way?" "Yes, sir, there's no other route." "Along this strip of grass?" "Certainly, Mr. Holmes." Holmes straightened, a glint of admiration in his eye. That was a very remarkable feat, remarkable indeed. Well, the path is exhausted. Let us move on. I assume this garden door is usually open." "Yes, sir, she simply walked in." Notice, the idea of murder does not seem to have been in her mind at first. She took no weapon with her, instead seizing the small knife from the professor's writing table. She moved through the corridor without leaving a trace on the coconut matting, and then into the study. How long was she there? "Not more than a few minutes, sir," replied Hopkins. "I forgot to mention that Mrs. Marker, the housekeeper, had been tidying the room just a quarter of an hour ago." Holmes nodded. "So we have a window. So our lady enters the study, then what? She approaches the writing table, but why? Not for the drawers, surely." Holmes leaned closer to the wooden bureau, eyes sharp. If she wanted anything valuable, it would have been locked. No, she was after something in this bureau. Wait, what's this scratch? "Hold a match, Watson," he said, frowning. "Hopkins, why did you not tell me about this?" The scratch traced along the brass on the right side of the keyhole, cutting through the varnish for about 4 inches. "I noticed it, Mr. Holmes," admitted Hopkins, "but scratches near a keyhole are common enough. Not this one. It's fresh. See how the brass shines through. An older scratch would have dulled to match the surface. Look through my lens. Notice the varnish, like soil pressed along a furrow." Holmes' gaze lifted. "Is Mrs. Marker here?" The housekeeper, a sad-faced elderly woman, stepped into the room. "Did you dust this bureau yesterday morning?" "Yes, sir." "Did you see this scratch?" "No, sir, I did not." "Of course not," Holmes said, his tone gentle. "A duster would have swept away these tiny shreds of varnish. Who has the key to this bureau?" "The professor keeps it on his watch chain." "Is it a simple key?" "No, sir, it's a Chubb's key." "Very well, Mrs. Marker, you may go." Holmes turned back to the bureau. "Now we are making progress. Our lady enters the study and approaches the bureau. She either opens it or attempts to. At that moment, Willoughby Smith enters. In her haste to withdraw the key, she scratches the door. Smith grabs her, and she snatches the nearest object, this knife, and strikes him to free herself. The blow is fatal. He collapses, and she escapes, with or without what she came for. Holmes' eyes swept the room. "Susan, the maid, could anyone have left that door after the cry, Susan?"
"No, sir. Impossible," Susan said firmly. "Before I even reached the bottom of the stairs, I would have seen anyone in the passage. Besides, the door never opened, or I would have heard it." "That settles this exit," Holmes said, nodding. "Then she must have left the way she came. This other passage leads only to the professor's room. There is no other exit?" "No, sir." Holmes's eyes glinted with curiosity. "We shall go down it and meet the professor. Hopkins, take note, this is very significant. The professor's corridor is also lined with coconut matting." "Well, sir, what of that?" Hopkins asked, puzzled. "Don't you see any relevance? Perhaps I am wrong, but it strikes me as suggestive. Come, introduce me." We followed the narrow, mat-lined corridor, equal in length to the one leading to the garden. At the end, a short flight of steps led to a closed door. Our guide rapped lightly, then ushered us into the professor's bedroom. The room was vast, overflowing with books. Shelves groaned under the weight, and volumes lay in haphazard piles on the floor, stacked in corners, spilling from every case. The bed, large and commanding, stood at the center. Propped against a mountain of pillows was the master of the house, a striking and unforgettable figure. A gaunt, aquiline face turned toward us, eyes sharp and dark, set deep beneath tufted, overhanging brows. His hair and beard were white, though the beard bore curious yellow stains around the mouth. A cigarette glowed among the tangled white hair, and the room reeked of stale smoke. As he extended his hand to Holmes, I noticed the yellow stains on his fingers. "A smoker, Mr. Holmes?" he asked in carefully chosen English, tinged with a slight, precise accent. "Pray, take a cigarette. And you, sir?" "I can recommend them," the professor said, lifting a fresh cigarette from a neat box, "prepared by Ionides of Alexandria. He sends me 1,000 at a time, and I must order a new supply every fortnight. Bad, isn't it? Very bad. But an old man has few pleasures left. Tobacco and my work. That is all." Holmes had already lit one, his eyes flicking like a hawk over every corner of the cluttered room, observing with subtle intensity. "Tobacco and my work, but now only tobacco," the old man murmured, a note of despair in his voice. "Alas, what a terrible, unforeseen catastrophe! So estimable a young man. My assistant was exemplary after only a few months of training. What do you make of it, Mr. Holmes?" "I have not yet made my mind. I shall be profoundly indebted to you if you can shed light where we are blind. To a poor bookworm and an invalid like myself, this is paralyzing. I feel as if I have lost the very faculty of thought. But you, sir, you are a man of action, a man accustomed to affairs of consequence. You maintain your balance in any emergency. We are indeed fortunate to have you here." Holmes began pacing along one side of the room, cigarette smoke curling in the dim light, moving with a controlled urgency. He smoked rapidly, as if sharing an unspoken affinity with our host for the sharp, aromatic Alexandrian tobacco. "Yes, it is a crushing blow. That pile on the side table," he gestured to a towering stack of papers, "represents my magnum opus, my analysis of the documents from the Coptic monasteries of Syria and Egypt, work that will strike at the very foundations of revealed religion. With my health failing, I know not if I shall ever complete it without my assistant. Dear me, Mr. Holmes, you smoke faster than I do myself." Holmes allowed a small, almost wry smile to cross his face. "I am a connoisseur," the professor said, drawing another cigarette from the box, his fourth, and lighting it from the stub of the previous one. "I will spare you any long cross-examination, Mr. Holmes, for I gather that I was in bed at the time of this tragedy and could know nothing first-hand. I would only ask one thing. What do you imagine my poor young assistant meant by his last words? The professor, it was she." The professor shook his head slowly, eyes clouded with sorrow.
"Susan is a country girl," he said. "You know the remarkable simplicity of that class. I fancy the poor fellow murmured some delirious, incoherent words, and she, in her own way, twisted them into this apparent message." "I see. So you have no personal explanation for this terrible event?" Holmes pressed. "Perhaps an accident, perhaps," he whispered, leaning closer. "A suicide? Young men have their secret troubles, affairs of the heart, or burdens we cannot know. It is a more likely theory than murder." "But the eyeglasses?" Holmes asked, raising an eyebrow. "Ah, I am but a dreamer," the professor replied with a faint smile. "I cannot explain the practicalities of life. Yet we must remember, tokens of love or obsession come in strange forms. A fan, a glove, a pair of glasses. Who can say what object a man might cling to in the final moments of his life? As for the footsteps in the grass, it is easy to be mistaken. The knife might have been thrown far from him as he fell. Perhaps I speak childishly, but to me it seems Willoughby Smith met his fate by his own hand." Holmes seemed struck by the suggestion. He continued to pace the room, cigarette after cigarette consumed between his thoughts, his mind clearly wrestling with the layers of mystery surrounding the death. "Tell me, Professor Coram," Holmes asked at last, his tone calm but probing, "what is in that cupboard in the bureau?" "Nothing that would interest a thief," he replied, his voice heavy with sorrow.
family papers, letters from my late wife, diplomas from the universities that honored me. Here is the key. You may look for yourself." Holmes took the key, studied it for a brief moment, then handed it back. "No," he said thoughtfully, "I doubt this will help me. I would prefer to wander your garden quietly and turn the matter over in my mind. Your suggestion of suicide is worth considering. We shall not disturb you further, Professor Coram. After lunch at 2 o'clock, we shall return and report anything of interest that has occurred in the meantime." Holmes seemed unusually distracted, and we strolled along the garden path in silence, the cold wind tugging at our coats. "Do you have a clue?" I asked at last, curiosity sharpening my voice. "It depends on these cigarettes I smoked," he said, a mysterious gleam in his eye. "It is possible I am entirely mistaken, but they will show me the way." "My dear Holmes," I exclaimed, incredulous, "how on earth?" "Well, you shall see for yourself. If nothing comes of it, no harm done. Of course, we always have the optician clue to rely upon, but one takes shortcuts when they present themselves. Ah, here is good Mrs. Marker. 5 minutes with her may prove instructive." Holmes had a singular way with women I had observed before. Within moments he had charmed the housekeeper, establishing a rapport as if he had known her for years. His conversation flowed naturally, blending courtesy with curiosity, and she responded with a trust that was instant and complete. "Yes, Mr. Holmes," Mrs. Marker said, nodding vigorously. "It's as you said, he smokes terribly, all day and sometimes all night. I've seen that room in the morning. You'd think a London fog had rolled in. Poor young Mr. Smith smoked too, but not nearly as much as the Professor. His health, well, I don't know if it was better or worse for it." "Ah," Holmes remarked, "but it surely kills the appetite." "I can't say about that, sir," she replied cautiously. "I suppose the Professor hardly eats then." "Well, he's variable, I'll say that for him." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "I'll wager he skipped breakfast today and won't touch lunch after the number of cigarettes I've seen him smoke."
"You're wrong, sir. He ate a surprisingly large breakfast this morning, better than I've seen in a long time, and he's ordered a good dish of cutlets for lunch. I must confess I'm surprised. After seeing young Mr. Smith lying there yesterday, I couldn't bear the sight of food. But the Professor, he hasn't let it affect his appetite one bit." We drifted through the garden for hours, the chill wind tugging at our coats. Stanley Hopkins had gone down to the village to follow up on rumors, a strange woman reportedly seen by children along the Chatham Road the previous morning. As for my friend, his usual restless energy seemed to have deserted him. I had never known Holmes approach a case in such a half-hearted manner. Even Hopkins's news that he had found the children and that they had indeed seen a woman matching Holmes's description, wearing glasses, elicited little more than a faint flicker of interest. It was only when Susan, who attended us at lunch, volunteered that she believed Mr. Smith had gone for a walk the previous morning and had returned barely half an hour before the tragedy, that Holmes's attention sharpened. I could not immediately see the significance of the detail, yet it was clear that Holmes was weaving it into the intricate pattern forming in his mind. Suddenly he sprang from his chair, his movements sharp and precise, and glanced at his watch. 2 o'clock, gentlemen," he said, his voice brisk. "It is time we confronted our friend, the Professor." We found the old man freshly seated after lunch. His empty plate testified to the appetite Mrs. Marker had described, and he looked every bit the eccentric scholar. His white mane framed face of sharp, gaunt angles, and his dark eyes glowed with an unsettling intensity. A cigarette smoldered perpetually in his mouth.
He had dressed meticulously and settled himself into a high-backed armchair by the fire, giving the impression of both authority and otherworldly distraction. "Well, Mr. Holmes," the professor said, a thin edge of challenge in his voice, "have you solved this mystery yet?" He nudged the large tin of cigarettes on the table towards Holmes. At the same moment, my friend reached for it, and together they tipped it over. Cigarettes skittered in every direction, clattering across the floor. For a few frantic moments, Stanley Hopkins, the professor, and I scrambled on our knees, collecting the scattered pieces. When we finally rose, I noticed a new energy in Holmes. His eyes sparkled, his cheeks tinged with color, those subtle battle signals of intense focus that always appeared at the critical moment. "Yes," Holmes said, quietly but firmly, "I have solved it." Stanley Hopkins and I exchanged incredulous glances. The gaunt professor's thin lips quivered in what might have been a sneer. "Indeed? And where, may I ask? In the garden?" "No. Here." "Here? Now?" "This instant," Holmes replied, eyes steady on the professor. "You are joking, Mr. Sherlock Holmes," the professor said, his voice tight. "This is far too serious a matter to treat so lightly." Holmes ignored the rebuke. "I have forged and tested every link in my chain of reasoning, Professor Coram, and I am satisfied that it is unbroken. The motives and the role you may play in this strange business remain uncertain to me. In a few moments, I trust I shall hear it from your own lips. Meanwhile, allow me to reconstruct the past for you, so you may understand the facts that I still require to complete the puzzle."
"A lady entered your study yesterday," Holmes began, his voice measured but sharp. "She came intending to seize certain documents from your bureau. She possessed a key of her own. I have examined yours, and I see no trace of discoloration. The scratch on the varnish could not have come from it. You were not involved, Professor. She acted alone, and, as far as the evidence shows, without your knowledge, seeking to rob you." The professor exhaled a long stream of smoke, his eyes wide and alert. "Most instructive," he said, his voice tinged with awe. "Surely, having tracked her movements this far, you can tell me where she has gone." Holmes leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I shall endeavor to do so. First, she was confronted by your secretary, and in a desperate bid to escape, she struck him. I am convinced, however, that she did not intend to inflict so grievous a wound. An assassin does not arrive unarmed. Shocked and horrified by the outcome, she fled in a panic. Unfortunately, she had lost her glasses in the struggle, and being extremely short-sighted, she was effectively blind without them." The detective paused, letting the weight of the moment hang in the air. "She ran down a corridor she believed led to her exit. Both corridors were lined with coconut matting. Only too late did she realize her mistake. She had taken the wrong passage, and her retreat was cut off. Trapped, unable to return, she pressed onward. She mounted a staircase, pushed open a door, and found herself in your room." Professor Coram sat frozen, mouth agape, his face a portrait of fear and incredulity. Then, forcing a laugh that did not reach his eyes, he waved a hand. "All very clever, Mr. Holmes," his voice strained, "but there is a flaw in your splendid theory. I remained in my room all day. I never left it." Holmes' expression was calm, almost gentle. "I am aware that, Professor Coram." "And you mean to tell me," the professor's voice cracked with incredulity, "that I could lie here upon this bed and not know a woman had entered my room?" "You did know,"
Holmes replied evenly. "You spoke with her. You recognized her. You aided her escape." The old man erupted into high-pitched laughter, his face lighting up with an unsettling glow. He rose to his feet, eyes burning like embers. "You are mad!" he shouted. "Insane! I aided her escape? Where is she now?" Holmes' hand extended toward the far corner of the room. "She is there." In that instant, a terrible shudder ran over the professor's features. He threw up his arms, convulsed, and sank back into his chair. And, as if on cue, the tall bookcase Holmes had indicated swung open on hidden hinges. A woman sprang out, her voice sharp and foreign. "You are right! You are right! I am here!" Dust clung to her hair and skin. Cobwebs from her hidden refuge draped her like a ghostly shawl. Her face was streaked with grime, and even without the dirt she had never been beautiful. Her features were exactly as Holmes had described, with the addition of a long, obstreperate chin. She blinked in the harsh light, disoriented by the sudden change from shadow to brightness, trying to assess who we were. And yet, despite the filth, the darkness, and the confusion, there was a strange nobility in her stance. Her chin lifted with a defiant pride, her head held high. There was a certain gallantry in her bearing that commanded respect, even admiration. Stanley Hopkins moved to seize her, his hand on her arm, but she brushed it aside with effortless authority. Her presence demanded obedience, and he stepped back. The old professor slumped further in his chair, his face twitching, eyes dark and brooding as he watched the woman before him. The room held its breath.
"Yes, sir," she said quietly, though every word trembled with tension. "I am your prisoner. From my hiding place, I heard everything. I know that you have discovered the truth. I confess it all. I killed the young man. But you are right, you who say it was an accident. I did not even know it was a knife I held. In my despair, I grabbed whatever lay on the table and struck at him to make him let me go. That is the truth, I swear it." Holmes studied her calmly. "Madam, I have no doubt that you speak the truth, but I fear you are in no state of mind to be well." Her face, streaked with dust, turned an ashen gray. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I have only a little time," she said, "yet you must hear everything. I am this man's wife. He is no Englishman. He is a Russian. His name I will not speak." At that, the old man stirred for the first time, his voice trembling. "God bless you, Anna. God bless you." She shot him a look of scorn, sharp and unflinching. "Why cling so desperately to that wretched life of yours, Sergius?" she demanded. "It has harmed many and benefited none, not even yourself. I will not end the thread of your existence. That is not for me. I have already carried too much since I crossed the threshold of this cursed house. But I must speak, or it will be too late." She paused, gathering her thoughts, her voice gaining strength. "As I have said, I am his wife. He was 50, and I a foolish girl of 20 when we married, in a city of Russia, at a university. I will not name it. God bless you, Anna," the old man murmured again, his voice cracking with emotion. "We were revolutionists, nihilists, you understand. He and I, and many others, fought for reform. Then the time of trouble came. A police officer was killed. Many were arrested. Evidence was demanded. To save his own life and win a reward, my husband betrayed me and all our companions." Her eyes burned with the memory, fixed on the floor as if replaying every horror. I survived, but I have carried the weight of his treachery ever since. And now this house, this young man, he paid for the consequences of a life built on deceit and betrayal. The room was silent. The only sound was the faint crackle of the fire and the steady smoke curling from Holmes's cigarette. Every eye remained on Anna, the tragic figure revealed at last, dust-streaked, haunted, yet unbroken. Yes, we were all arrested upon his betrayal, she continued, her voice low but steady. Some of us found our way to the gallows, others to Siberia. I was among the latter, though my sentence was not for life. My husband, meanwhile, came to England with his ill-gotten gains and has lived quietly ever since, safe in the knowledge that the Brotherhood would have caught him swiftly had they known his location. The old man, shaking, reached out and helped himself to a cigarette. "I am in your hands, Anna," he murmured. "You were always good to me." Anna's eyes blazed. "You have not heard the full extent of your villainy. Among our comrades in the order was one man, the friend of my heart, noble, unselfish, loving, all that my husband was not. He abhorred violence, yet we were all swept into it. He wrote endlessly begging us to avoid such a fate. His letters could have saved him. My diary, in which I recorded every feeling, every decision, could have saved him too. But my husband, your hand, Sergius, he found and hid both. He tried with all his cunning to destroy the young man's life. In that he failed, but Alexis was sent as a convict to Siberia, now toiling in a salt mine as I speak." Her voice rose, sharp as a whip. "Think of that, you villain, you villain! At this very moment, Alexis, a man whose name you are not worthy to speak, suffers and labors like a slave, while I have your life in my hands, and I let you go." The old man exhaled smoke slowly, his face a mixture of awe and fear. "You were always a noble woman, Anna," he said softly, the words trembling on his lips.
Anna rose, only to falter, a small cry of pain escaping her. "I must finish," she said, steadying herself on the edge of the bed. "When my term ended, I resolved to recover the diary and the letters, which, if delivered to the Russian government, would win my friend's freedom. I knew he had come to England. Months of searching revealed his hiding place, and I knew he still held the diary, for while in Siberia, I once received a letter from him, reproaching me, quoting its pages, taunting me with the truth he had stolen." She paused, her chest heaving. "I came for justice, but fate, misfortune, made a witness of Willoughby Smith. I never meant to kill him. That was not my plan. Yet his life ended that day, and my path brought me here, to confront the man who caused so much misery. And now you see him, gentlemen, how a life built on treachery can haunt itself to its final hour." The room was heavy with silence. Holmes's eyes gleamed with quiet triumph, but he said nothing, letting the story, the full measure of betrayal, revenge, and redemption, settle upon everyone present. Outside, the wind swept the cold marshes in mournful gusts, echoing the long shadows of a past that would not let go. I knew, deep in my bones, that his thirst for control would never allow him to surrender those papers willingly. He would rather destroy them than let them fall into my hands. So I chose another path. I chose deception. I hired a man from a private detective agency and placed him inside my husband's house under a false identity. He became his secretary, your second secretary, Sergius,
the one who vanished so abruptly. He discovered that the papers were hidden in the locked bureau. He took an impression of the key, but he dared go no further. He gave me a detailed plan of the house and told me something vital. Every morning, the study stood empty while the secretary worked upstairs. That was when I made my decision. I gathered what courage I had left and went there myself. I succeeded, but the price was terrible. I had just taken the papers and was locking the cupboard when the young man seized me. I recognized him at once. I had seen him earlier that very morning. We had crossed paths on the road, and I, ignorant that he worked for my husband, had asked him to tell me where Professor Coram lived. Holmes nodded sharply. Exactly, exactly. He returned and told his employer about the woman he had met, and with his final breath he tried to say it was she, the same woman he had just spoken of. "You must let me finish," Anna said, her voice tightening, pain etched across her face. "When he fell, I fled in terror. I chose the wrong door. Instead of escape, I found myself in my husband's room. He threatened to betray me, to hand me over, and I showed him the truth, that if he did, his life would end with mine. If I went to the law, he would go to the Brotherhood. He knew I meant it. He knew his fate was bound to mine." She drew a breath, steady but shallow. "I did not cling to life for my own sake. I lived only for one purpose, to finish what I had begun. And so, for that reason alone, he protected me. He hid me in that secret chamber, a relic of another age, known only to him. He took all his meals in this room, so he could give me food without raising suspicion."
Her eyes lifted slowly, heavy with truth and exhaustion. "That is how I survived. That is how the truth remained buried, until now." The room felt smaller somehow, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Holmes stood silent, his expression unreadable, while the weight of betrayal, sacrifice, and unintended bloodshed settled over us like a gathering storm. It had all been arranged. Once the police finished their work and left the house, I was to disappear into the night and never return. That was the plan. But somehow, you read it all. You saw straight through us. She reached into the front of her dress and drew out a small, carefully wrapped packet. Her hands trembled, but her voice did not. "These are my final words," she said quietly. "This packet will save Alexis. I place it in your hands, trusting your honor and your devotion to justice. Take it, deliver it to the Russian embassy. That is all I ask." She pressed it toward Holmes. "My duty is done, and—" "Stop her!" Holmes shouted. He lunged forward and tore a small glass vial from her fingers. "Too late," she whispered, collapsing backwards onto the bed. A faint, sorrowful smile touched her lips. "Too late. I took the poison before I left my hiding place. The room spins. I am going now. Promise me this. Remember the packet." Her eyes lost their focus. The strength left her body as gently as a fading breath. Silence followed, final, unbreakable. Later, as the train carried us back towards London, Holmes leaned back in his seat, his expression calm once more, almost detached. "A simple case," he said at last, "and yet instructive in several respects. From the beginning, everything turned upon the Pince-Nez. Without that single piece of evidence, without the dying man's instinctive grip, I doubt we would ever have uncovered the truth." He gazed out the window as the countryside slipped past. "The strength of the lenses told me at once that the woman was nearly blind. Deprived of her glasses, she would have been helpless. And yet you were asked to believe that she walked a narrow strip of wet grass without a single misstep. As I remarked at the time, It was a remarkable feat. Holmes allowed himself the faintest smile. In my mind, it was impossible, unless she carried a second pair of glasses. When that explanation failed, only one conclusion remained. She never left the house at all. He tapped his fingers together. The identical corridors confirmed it. In her panic, she mistook one for the other and fled straight into the professor's room. From that moment, I watched him closely. I searched his chamber for any sign that would support my suspicion. His voice lowered. The carpet was intact, no trapdoor, but books often conceal more than knowledge. A recess behind a shelf was not only possible, it was likely. Everything else followed naturally. The train slowed as the city drew near. A tragic affair, Holmes concluded. Justice was served, though not by the hand of the law. And somewhere in the frozen wastes of Siberia, an innocent man would soon walk free because one woman chose truth over life itself. He fell silent again, and I knew the case of the Golden Pince-Nez was finally at rest.
As you know, Holmes began, such devices are often hidden in old libraries. Everywhere else the books were scattered on the floor, but this one bookcase stood perfectly clear. That alone suggested a secret. I could see no visible marks to indicate a door, but the dun-colored carpet was ideal for examination. He leaned back, drawing a long breath. I smoked a considerable number of those excellent cigarettes and dropped the ashes deliberately across the floor in front of the suspected bookcase. A simple trick, but remarkably effective. From the patterns left in the ash, every step could be read like a map. Then I went downstairs, careful not to reveal my intentions to anyone. Holmes' eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a plan coming together. In your presence, Watson, I observed that Professor Corum's consumption of food had increased, a subtle sign that he was now sustaining a second person in the room. Returning to the study, I tipped over the cigarette box, giving me a perfect view of the floor. There it was, written plainly in the scattered ashes. The prisoner had emerged from her secret retreat while we were absent. He exhaled a thin ribbon of smoke and smiled. Well, Hopkins, here we are, safe and sound at Charing Cross. Congratulations on bringing your case to a successful close. You will no doubt report to headquarters immediately. As for us, Watson, I think you and I shall drive straight to the Russian embassy without delay.
And thus the story ended. If you liked this journey into the worlds of classic literature, do not forget to support us by subscribing so we can tell you more. And hey, if there's a classic tale you'd love to hear told in this suspenseful style, drop its name in the comments below. Your suggestion might be our next chilling adventure.